Hello, Brav. We're starting with another pictorial covered Victorian novel, Witch Hazel by Mrs. Georgie Sheldon. Written in 1892, though, yeah, that's when this is. Actually, the copyright says 1888. This is the 1892 version. Witch Hazel, Chapter 1, The Wreck. On a small island 4 miles distant from any land, there stands a huge lighthouse whose weather-beaten sides have breasted the storms of nearly half a century. Strong and rugged, it towers aloft, rising from its rocky bed to the height of 60 feet, and like some grim sentinel, keeps watch over the wide waste of waters, which stretches out on every side around it. Night by night, as soon as the sun sinks beneath the horizon, its huge lamps are swung aloft in the great tower, where, with stately resolutions, they send streaming forth upon the murky sea a white, a blue, a red, and a green glow to warn distant vessels from the treacherous rocks and shoals that lie about it. Close behind this massive structure, and built up against it, is the small house in which dwells the honest and faithful man, whose duty it is to keep the lights aloft, trimmed and burning. A large garden slopes away from this to the south, and the whole is enclosed by a massive wall to protect it from the fierce storms and mountain waves which sometimes sweep over this small oasis in the watery desert, as if bent upon its annihilation. This garden is the pride of the lighthouse keeper and his little grandson, who spend much time raising choice vegetables and flowers, and twice a week ship them to the neighboring city by the bustling little tugboat, which touches at the island to leave necessary supplies for the few people who live there. The only other inhabitants of the desolate place are a middle-aged woman who has kept house for the worthy light-keeper ever since the death of his wife 8 years previous to the opening of our story, and her son, who assists about the lights, minds the cow, pig, and chickens, and performs various other duties. Old Sandy Morton, as the keeper was called, had been a sailor in his early life, and he dearly loved the sea in spite of the hardship which he had endured upon it, and the many sorrows it had brought him first and last. He is tall, strong, stalwart, a perfect giant, in fact, physically, with a genial and honest, though seamed and weather-beaten face, and his 60 years of toil and hardship sit lightly upon him. And he is as punctual and conscientious in the performance of his duties as the rising and setting sun himself. For more than 20 years he has held his present position, and to all appearances is likely to hold it for as many more. His grandson Percy is a bright, handsome boy of 10, and wise beyond his years. Brown as a berry from exposure to all kinds of weather, hardy as a mountain buck, and jolly as a young tar. There is yet something about him, a certain dignity and refinement, which makes him appear as if he should have been born to an entirely different kind of life. He is the idol of his fond grandsire's heart, and the old gentleman cannot bear to have him out of his sight for even a single hour. Years ago, Sandy Morton had a promising son. He, too, was a sailor, having inherited his father's love for the sea, and he finally rose to be the captain of a fine merchantman, which was the pride of his heart. Upon his return from his first trip as captain, he had married a sweet girl whom he had long loved, and she, refusing to be separated from him, declared that she would share the perils of the deep with him rather than live alone on land. One short, happy year they spent together upon the bounding billows, and then, while in a foreign port, a fine boy was born to them. They set out upon their homeward voyage filled with hope and joy. Favoring gales speeded them on their way. Smooth seas smiled treacherously until, when almost in sight of their native shores, a fearful storm wrecked the stanch vessel, and husband and wife and the best part of the crew went down into the raging depths. When a puny little child, only a few months old, was brought to Sandy Morton and his good wife, with the sad tidings that he had all they had left to be comfort, that he was all they had left to be the comfort and stay of their declining years. It seemed at first as if life had lost all its charm for them, as if their burden was heavier than they could bear. For 2 years, Sandy Morton's wife devoted herself to the care of the child, whom she grew to love most fondly. Then she was called to another world, and Sandy felt as if but a very slender thread bound him to earth. But day by day the tendrils of his heart twined themselves about the boy, thus twice left motherless, until he became the very life of his life, the joy and solace of his old age. And now, at the age of 10, he believed him the finest boy in all the kingdom. One dark evening in November, about this time, Sandy Morton and his grandson were sitting by the fire in their snug kitchen. The old gentleman was reading his weekly paper. Percy was engaged with a copy of Livingstone's Travels, of which he was very fond, while Mrs. Butler was busy with the week's mending. All at once the outer door was flung noisily open, and a young man of perhaps 24 years appeared before the startled group with pale face and trembling limbs. "What is it, Jim?" demanded the lightkeeper, looking up from his paper. "There's something wrong out yonder, sir," Jim responded, pointing with his thumb over his right shoulder toward the sea. Sandy Morton arose quickly and strode to the door, a white, set look on his face, for he never heard of a vessel in danger without thinking how his own son and his own fair wife had been lost when almost in sight of his own door. The night was fearfully dark, the wind was blowing fiercely, the waves ran high and leaped against the rock-girt island with a sullen roar, like some wild animal in the act of springing upon its prey. Suddenly, as Captain Morton looked, a vivid line of light went streaming up into the dark vault above, about a mile away to the south of him. It was a rocket, and for a moment it lighted up the dark sea and threatening sky. Then it went out, and thick darkness reigned again. "What is it, grandfather?" asked Percy, who had dropped his book and followed the keeper of his to the door. "There is a vessel of some kind in danger, and the captain is throwing lights as signals of distress," returned the man in a low, intense voice. Then he called out in a tone of command, "Jim, run! Get out the boat. We must do what we can. Sure, sir, we never can go to any ship on such a night as this. We couldn't see an inch before us, let alone battling with such a sea. We must try it at least. We've no right to turn our backs upon those perishing souls," the captain returned resolutely as he drew on a rough, heavy coat and pulled a fur cap down over his ears, then followed this man, who was already halfway to the boathouse. "Let me go with you, grandfather," Percy cried, springing toward him, his eager young voice rising above the roar of the wind and the waves. No, lad, I couldn't risk you on such a wild night. If 'twas daylight, I'd think about it, for maybe you could steer for us. Go in and stay with Mrs. Butler. Keep the house warm and have plenty of hot water and blankets handy." Percy knew that he must obey, but he looked wistfully after the old gentleman's receding form, and his heart bounded into his throat as just then he saw another rocket shoot upward, and he realized that perhaps scores of human beings might be on the verge of a watery grave. It was with a grave, saddened face that he turned back into the house to deliver his grandfather's message about the blankets and hot water to the housekeeper. But when Sandy Morton reached the boat landing, he saw that it was simply impossible to launch his boat. The waves ran so high that it was thrown roughly back upon the beach in spite of their most strenuous efforts, while the darkness was so intense that they could not see a hand's breadth before them. The wind howled and shrieked, the sea roared as if in derision at their helplessness, while every now and then, far out over the surging billows, that light of flame would shoot upward, telling of wreck and ruin and death. "We can't do it, Jim," Sandy Morton shouted in his man's ear. "She wouldn't live a minute in this sea. We'd be swamped in no time. And even if we weren't, we never could reach the ship in this pitchy darkness. We'll have to bride till morning, though my heart misgives me that those poor souls out yonder are all go to the bottom afore daylight." "Aye, aye, sir," shouted Jim in response, and then the two men With heavy hearts, bore their boat back under cover, after which they returned to the warm and cheerful kitchen to wait for the dawn. All night long, the good lighthouse keeper watched those distant signals. He could not sleep. He was too heavily oppressed with fear and anxiety. Frequently, he went out to the door to see what the weather was, looking out wistfully toward the spot where he knew the wreck to be, and longing to brave every danger and go to the rescue of those suffering, perishing people. They're wrecked on Ainsley Crag, he sighed, in full sight of land. May the Lord have mercy on them and keep them safe till daylight breaks. He had insisted that all the others should go to bed, although Percy had pleaded to be allowed to share his lonely vigil. No, my lad, go to bed and get what rest you can, for there's no knowing what tomorrow will bring, the old man said sadly. I pray we may save some souls, but I'm sore afraid it'll be too late then. Great reading there, Bob. Thanks, buddy. Just as soon as day began to dawn, the keeper called his man, and together they went out into the cold and dismal storm to see what they could do. To their great joy, they could just discern the hulk of a large vessel stranded, as the captain had surmised, on Ainsley Crag, about a mile away. They had just succeeded in launching their boat when Percy came bounding down to the shore. Let me go, he cried with breathless eagerness. I can steer, then you and Jim can both row. The old man hesitated a moment. The boy was the only thing he had left to love, and he could not endure the thought of taking him into danger. Still, he knew that he might be of great service, for he was an intelligent young sailor, and both he and Jim would have a hard pull at the oars at the best. Well, Percy, my lad, you shall go if you like, though I'd like it better had you stayed in bed. The Lord preserve us all, and grant that we may save some poor souls. A minute later, they were pulling toward that dark object and its perishing human freight. But it was a fearful task. The wind was against them, while every wave threatened to swamp their frail craft, and though the two men bent all their strength to the oars, and the lad at the helm did his very best to help them, they made but slow progress. Hi, grandfather, she's off the rocks, Percy suddenly called out, and turning to look, Sandy Morton saw that he had spoken truly. A huge wave had lifted the vessel from her perilous position, only to drive her into more fearful danger. For he knew well that if her bottom was stove in, she must surely sink in a very few minutes. Pull, men, pull for your life, he cried, and with renewed energies they breasted the raging billows. But even while they worked, the keeper could see the doomed vessel settling lower and lower, and he feared that, after all, they would be too late to save a single life. His face grew white and rigid, and his heart was torn with agony, for too well he knew that it had been in just this way that his own son, with his fair young wife, had gone down to their death years ago. They had been seen by the ill-fated people on board the steamer, and they who had strength enough left to do so crowded to the side of the vessel, calling with shrieks and prayers to the men to hasten and save them. They were very near now, and a rope was thrown out to them. A moment more, and they seized it, and it was made fast to the boat. But at that instant a terrible sound smote the ear of Sandy Morton, and the vessel rocked to and fro, then began to whirl slowly in the water. Look out, Jim! Let go of that rope. Cut it. We're too late after all. Oh, heavens, the vessel's going down, and we too shall be caught in the swirl of the waters. Off, Jim, with all your might. Port the helm, lad, he concluded, gesticulating wildly to Percy. Shriek after shriek of agony went up from the passengers of the ill-fated steamer as they realized that their moment of doom had come. Frantic cries and prayers to be saved nearly drove the occupants of that small boat wild, for they knew how utterly powerless they were to do anything in the face of the opposing elements. And this unforeseen calamity had come so suddenly. The rope was cut, and Jim was about to resume his car, and put off in obedience to his master's command, when from the end of the ship nearest them there rang out a stern, authoritative voice. Here, man, just one moment, in God's name, hold out your arms, quick. Sandy Morton turned. A man stood leaning far over the bulwarks, holding what looked to be a bundle of shawls and clothing. The keeper had just time to stretch out his arms in obedience to the man's prayer, when the bundle came flying through space, propelled by the strength of despair, and dropped into them. Then the man with the white, agonized face sank weak and helpless upon the deck, and Percy never forgot the sight to his dying day. Sandy Morton dropped his burden in the bottom of the boat. He knew he had no time to lose, caught up his oar, and bidding his man pull for dear life, they managed to sweep out of the way of the doomed vessel, while a friendly wave just then bore them further from the terrible danger that menaced them. There was a repetition of that terrible sound that Sandy had heard before, like the suction of a great whirlpool. The great ship shook and trembled from stem to stern, and then reeling on one end went down in that fearful vortex made by the swirling waters. It was all over in less time than it takes to tell it, and only that frail boat with its awe-stricken occupants was visible upon the wild waste of waters, as it was propelled by both waves and oars back toward the friendly shore. I've yet to encounter a witch, but I'll be patient. Until next time, goodbye.